With the release of Parasite Eve 2, Square had cemented the title as an ongoing franchise. Although the fanbase was splintered due to massive changes in gameplay between entries, everybody was looking forward to a third installment, so they might get some type of concrete resolution for the characters they've come to know and love. The wait would be a long one, and the characters wouldn't exactly be what they remembered, but that resolution would eventually come. On December 22nd, 2010, nearly 11 years to the day they released Parasite Eve 2, the third birthday released in Japan, later coming out in North America and the EU in March and April of 2011 respectively. Although it was initially announced the game would release episodically on mobile phones, that idea was scrapped quickly. Instead, they developed the game for the PS3 and then scaled it down, packaged it as a single piece of software, and sold it on physical UMD for the Sony PSP. Much like Parasite Eve 2 before it, the third birthday splintered the audience even further, as it deviated into yet another totally new direction for the series. Because of its radical change in gameplay and the fact that the game no longer bears the title of Parasite Eve, many people strike this game from the canon and insist that it is little more than a spin-off made for cheap entertainment. This is not the case. Similar to how Monster Hunter 5 was renamed to Monster Hunter World so that new players would not feel a barrier to entry, so too was Parasite Eve renamed to The Third Birthday. The idea in its development was to utilize new game technology and mechanics to bring Aya Brea to a new audience while at the same time build a proper continuation for her character for returning fans. As such, this game is its own standalone entry, as well as the canonical end to the series. So how well did they introduce Aya Brea to a new world of gamers in the new modern world of video games? Now, before we go any further, just to note, all the footage you're going to see was recorded with an emulator. I do own the game and I do own a PSP to properly play the game, but I'd have no way of capturing the footage this way. Using a PS3 controller, I mapped the button inputs to exactly what you would get on a PSP, so I could have as genuine an experience as I possibly could. So with no further ado, let's get into the story. If you're a returning fan to the series, you're probably not expecting a story about time travel. But a time travel story is exactly what we got. At the start of the game, we get a look at the future, New York 2012. Remember, this game came out in 2010 initially, so 2012 is the future. Everything seems relatively normal until this massive tentacle-looking lifeform erupts from the ground, throwing about cars and buildings like a toddler playing with toys. This tentacle formation is known as a Babel. From the Babel spawns many alien life forms known as the Twisted. Fast forward another year and a new organization called the Counter-Twisted Investigation, or CTI for short, has formed. One of the key members of this organization, its star agent, is none other than Aya Brea. However, Aya isn't anything like how you may remember her. Aya is no longer the tough, independent woman she was in the older games. Here, although she can still kick major ass, she has been reduced to an emotionally weak shell of a person who seems to greatly lack any depth of character beyond her ability to cry and get her ass in the camera's focus with seemingly no effort at all. Initially, the change in her personality is explained by amnesia she suffered following a tragic event 3 years prior, but we'll hear more on that later. Following her amnesia, Aya discovers she can transfer her soul between bodies and beyond space and time. This ability is called Overdrive. Overdrive is what makes her such a valuable commodity for CTI, and the only reason CTI can even operate. For the remainder of the game, Aya follows Revolver Ocelot's orders and jumps back through time to different periods in an attempt to prevent the Babel from ever occurring. As this is going on, the threads of time are unwoven and rewritten, as Aya receives flashbacks to the tragedy that caused her amnesia 3 years before. The more you uncover about the source of the Babel and the creatures it created, the more the story becomes needlessly convoluted. The tone never ceases taking itself entirely too seriously, and with every twist and turn the plot takes, it just becomes more and more difficult to continue caring about the why of it all. With the story so convoluted, some additional backstory is almost a necessity, but the amount of backstory that would be required to make the story feel smooth is so immense that the pace of the game would suffer drastically to include it all. And so the compromise here is that the backstory exists in-game text documents. Now, if you want a smooth story, you have to make the choice to read the extra documents yourself. And if you feel that reading these documents slows the game down too much, well, that's your fault because you're the one who made the choice to read it. Really, not much can be said about the story beyond this, as the story fails to make much sense until you reach the climax, and I'd like to hold off on spoilers until at least the end. In short, giant monsters are taking over Earth, and an amnesiac Aya Brea must travel back in time to prevent it. Brushing that out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay, this game's biggest deviation from its previous two entries. The Third Birthday is just like Parasite Eve 2 in one sense and one sense only. Both games looked to popular games of the time to model their mechanics after. Around 2010, first and third person shooters were in, and one of the latest and most influential advancements in the genre came from Gears of War. So what does this mean for the Third Birthday? Well, it means you get to experience taking cover behind chest-high walls on a 4.3-inch screen. In many ways, Third Birthday is a generic third-person shooter for its time, and in many ways, it's not. Aya can bring 3 guns into battle, and her loadout is up to you. You can buy numerous different types of guns between missions and at checkpoints, and also pay to add upgrades onto them. To switch guns, simply hold square and press the corresponding direction on your D-pad. Because of the PSP's limitations, you'll find a lot of work went into putting all the necessary mechanics for a third-person shooter into far less buttons. As a result, many buttons serve multiple purposes. Tapping square reloads your gun. Using the D-pad while not holding square is how you move your camera. Control-wise, this may be the biggest problem. While the camera has a bit of automatic control, it's not quite good enough to do all that you need. All character movement is done with the analog stick, so using the D-pad that's right above it on the same side of the PSP to control camera movement is cumbersome at best. This basically makes controlling your camera and character at the same time nearly impossible, and in a third-person shooter, good tight control is a necessity. With a degree of fumbling, you can get it, but it hardly feels ideal. You can fire with R and aim down sights with L. Circle throws grenade and X is more or less a general action button. While aiming at an enemy, if you idle long enough without shooting, something called a linkage meter will appear. This meter indicates your allies are taking aim at the same target you are. When the meter is charged, give the order and you all open fire for massive damage. When enough damage is inflicted fast enough, you'll see this triangle appear on your target. This is how Aya's overdive ability plays into battle, and how Third Birthday separates itself from other generic third-person shooters of the time. When this symbol appears, hit triangle. This will cause Aya to dive into the enemy and do massive damage from within. To traverse to different areas of a stage quickly, or simply to replenish some health or get a new weapon in your 4th weapon slot, you can also dive into your allies and adopt their stats and loadout. You will not take on their image, but everything that was once theirs now becomes yours. This adds a lot to combat and kind of inadvertently makes Aya a bit of a bad guy if we throw aside ludonarrative dissonance. To win in some of these battles, you'll need to be willing to dive into your allies and just allow them to get killed. To prevent the babble, Aya is going to leave a trail of innocent dead bodies in her wake, and just disregard their corpses like the ragdolls thrown by the wayside that they are. But it is a rather fun setup, and that's what matters most. At the bottom right here, you'll notice the Liberation Mode meter. This is charged over time and by attacking enemies. When it's full, hitting circle and triangle at the same time will put you into Liberation Mode. This is Aya's most powerful ability, aside from time travel. Your movement becomes short-range teleportation, your pistols have infinite ammo and increased damage, and your opportunities to dive into enemies becomes much more frequent. But the mode does not last for long, and it takes a long time to charge it up. All of this makes for a rather compelling, albeit cumbersome battle system for the PSP. But camera aside, there are issues with its ability to remain fun, and this largely comes from the length and scale of the battles as well as the enemy types. Unfortunately, the majority of the enemies, while interesting concepts, are not that fun to fight, and the length you must fight them for can be absolutely infuriating. You can't just choose to run away either, as most progression in the game is moving from one locked room to the next. Once you enter a room, you cannot leave until you kill all the enemies and enemy generators. Although this game only has about 7 hours of main story content, your playtime will stretch to roughly the 10-hour mark, having to replay areas following multiple game overs. If it seems Third Birthday dropped all the RPG mechanics from earlier entries, this isn't quite the case. Aya can level up with XP, but it hardly feels like it has much effect. One of the coolest things you get to build Aya stronger is called the DNA board. This DNA board is a 3x3 grid, which you can equip different kinds of orbs and different patterns to. If you place your orbs correctly, you can maximize the space you have by causing overlapped abilities to combine or level up. If you don't use your space well, you will have a bunch of weak abilities, or even negative effects on your character. While it's not very deep, it's a great idea, easy to understand, and very useful. And the last thing I want to talk about here, you probably already noticed, and that's the fan service. As Aya takes damage, this damage is reflected in her attire. As you guys know, I have no problem with fan service, but its inclusion in this game feels very out of place, and definitely left a bad taste in most people's mouths shortly after release. Strangely enough, this idea was first introduced by character designer Tetsuya Nomura. Along with 15 other ideas, they sent this idea to everybody in the office to vote on. The top 5 ideas would make it into the game, and everybody thought this idea was one of the top 5. There's never a real reason for this in the game, it's simply here because it could be done. Does she look good? For a PSP game, of course she does, but given the overwhelmingly serious tone of the game, it comes off as just out of place. She's not the only one that underwent a character change either. Maida from Parasite Eve 1 makes a return, only now he's some lowly Japanese pervert with a strange idolization complex for Aya. And his voice acting, my god.
You said the Babel is an overdive system. Are you positive?
I compared the remains of the previous device with the Babel's structure. Although they differ in parts, the basics are the same. The one responsible for creating the CTI device is.
It's not that he can't act proper tones, but I find myself wondering if the voice actor ever read a written piece of text in his life. While the majority of the voice actors are okay, some are just barely any better. Like your one friend who still has a really young voice trying his best at a Christian Bale Batman impersonation.
We'll go elsewhere. Besides, she doesn't need to hear what we have to say.
Visually, I would say this game has the best graphics of the trilogy, but possibly the worst art design and setting. The cinematics are rad as hell and really highlight one of Square's strongest points as a development studio. The sound effects are mostly good. The game runs well, and the soundtrack, as unpopular as this might be to say, I thought was pretty great. It's not as good as Parasite Eve 1's, but some of the songs it takes from that game I actually thought were improved upon in this one. Listen to these 2 clips here, the first being from Parasite Eve 1, and the second being the reorchestration on Third Birthday. Personally, I prefer the latter. Now that covers just about everything, but a while back I asked a 2-pronged question. When this game went into development, its intent was to introduce Aya Brea to a new generation of gamers and use a new generation style of gameplay. Did they succeed? Well, despite a few hang-ups, I think they succeeded at half of it. I think they made an interesting yet convoluted story with some fun gameplay mechanics, limited only by the system the game was developed for, and a few enemies that simply weren't fun to fight. What they failed at resoundingly was introducing Aya to a new audience of gamers and carrying on her legacy as they intended. And I don't say this because of her amnesia-triggered personality change. No, it's a bit more insulting than that. And to explain it, I'm going to have to spoil the whole story. If you guys don't want it spoiled for you, click this time down here. You got about 5 seconds. Alright, time's up. Let's get into it. So, in 2010, in this story, Aya is at a church getting married to her lover. In the audience is the young Eve. During the wedding, a SWAT team arrives and opens fire. Aya is shot and on the verge of death. To save Aya's life, Eve dives into her body. This causes Aya's spirit to split into pieces and spread throughout the world to later manifest themselves as the Twisted. So in part, the entire story happens because Eve tried to save Aya's life. The Babel, the Twisted, the time travel, everything. The story actually gets more convoluted than this, but that's what you need to know. Following the attack at the church, Aya has a new personality and the ability to time travel, because Aya is actually Eve in Aya's body. The true Aya doesn't get any screen time until roughly the last 6 minutes of the game. The Aya we all know and love is still in the game, and she's still as strong and badass as we remember, but again, she's only in it for the last 6 minutes. The rest of the game you actually play as Eve. If this is how you introduce an established character to a new audience, this couldn't have been done more wrong. But good on the writers, they managed to find a way to change her entire character and assuage criticism that the established character was de-written. That said, I'm still going to launch the criticism at them anyway. This honestly just feels like an overly convoluted way to use an established character and body to sell a game with a different personality. They wanted to make a character that resembled the wave of moe anime girls that were taking over the world at the time, and they knew they would be raked over the coals if they seemingly changed her for no reason, so this is what they came up with. A Parasite Eve game where Aya gets less screen time than anybody else. Who could have saw that coming? On its own, I think the game is fun enough, and my biggest complaints are merely through feeling like I've been cheated as a fan. But that feeling isn't a legitimate criticism of the work, as it's not based on the merits of the game itself. I think this game is best enjoyed the same way I feel Parasite Eve 2 is, as its own entirely separate thing. In fact, looking back at the whole trilogy, I feel that way about each game in the series. As a series, its identity seems to be not having an identity at all. Each piece is best experienced by considering it separate from the rest. I wouldn't avoid recommending any of these games, but I likely wouldn't recommend all of them to the same person. Based on your tastes, some entries will work and some simply will not. And thus concludes the Parasite Eve trilogy of reviews. If you guys found this video useful or entertaining at all, like, comment, subscribe. Links to socials are in the description, share the video if you can, and as always folks, thanks for watching.